Okay. Thanks again, Yana, for organizing this. I'm Jan Miksovsky from Component Kitchen, tiny little two-person consulting company that focuses just on web components. We've been doing that for a long time. I'm up here in Seattle, and then my partner's down in the Bay Area. One of the most common questions we get about web components is how to customize them. That includes styling, but also, as I'll show, changing their behavior. And I wanted to talk about that because I think it's a critical thing that we get right. It's possible using any component model to organize your UI code, and that's a benefit of doing something with web components or React or any component model is going to give you that. But what I'm really excited about is the potential for use of components of UI across teams and across organizations. I think that's going to allow us to build better user experiences by starting with better parts instead of having to reinvent everything ourselves. For that to work, you need to be able to start with something that's general purpose, write it at a certain level of generality without knowing everywhere that it's going to be used, and then allow people to specialize it for their own context. That's sort of core to the nature of reuse. But it's hard to create components that are customizable like that. People tend to write components for their own needs, for their own app, and then they say, "Oh, I've got this thing. I want to give it to other people." And a lot of times, in the early days of web components, when I would find one that was interesting, I often couldn't get it to run at all in the context of a different application because it was so specialized to the context for which it had been written. So I want to talk about how we can think about customizing components. I'll present some ideas based on component work that we've been doing, and you can sort of incorporate that into your own work. First of all, I just want to consider the question, why is it hard to do this? Why is it hard to create UI that can be customized? I think UI is really fascinating. If I'm doing work on the back end, or I'm doing work on the front end, but low-level stuff that the user can't see, for virtually any problem that I face, I can go to NPM and find a library that does an awesome job at whatever that is. Or I'll find 3 libraries that are awesome at that each have 10,000 people contributing to it. And I'll just pick one and it'll basically work. We don't have that kind of flexibility on the front end though. On the high level, what the user can see, we just do not see that kind of reuse. You see a few things like libraries like material design or something special, but that is going to be designed with one company's brand in mind and really not suitable for everybody. So why is that? I think that the key word that I want you to think about is variation. Like there's just a lot of variability in UI that doesn't come up with back-end services. Like no one ever says like, oh, hey, I want to use this auth library that you wrote, but our brand really isn't about 64 bits. We go for 65 bits in our keys or something. Like you just don't see that. Like there's consistency everywhere else, but not at the UI layer. So we can start with like a general purpose pattern. Like you take something like an image carousel that you might find in a mobile application. So it might be very simple. You might find that same kind of pattern on a desktop application, maybe in a website for browsing properties. And okay, they've got a carousel. This is a little different. It's got like page numbers and thumbnails and arrows. Or you might look at something like a calendar app. You don't think of a calendar as a carousel, but it's basically the same thing. You're swiping left and right, only a calendar is infinitely long in either direction. Like that's pretty weird. That's not part of the stock calendar. You can't have dots at the bottom for every day in time. So that's different. You could have a tutorial. That's going to feel a little different. Or even an ebook reader. Like there's all this stuff that uses this pattern, but it's all totally different. You can't, and there's no way someone's going to build like the one carousel to rule them all that's got like 6,000 properties and you can just sort of set the knobs to get one of these things. Like that's a sort of a combinatorial explosion. You can't build that and maintain it. So we need other ways of building components like this. The variation is fundamental. Like, it's not going to go away. It comes up for tons of reasons. Could be a historical accident. It could be situational, like the needs, your users want to be able to do something super quick that other users just don't care about. And so, like, you need different behavior in your variation on a component. Sometimes there's, like I said, there's just differentiation. Like, you and I are both trying to do the exact same thing, but we want to make ours look different intentionally so that people can tell them apart. So these are some of the things that come up with variation and why it matters. It's not just styling, like behavior varies too. For any little micro interaction, like closing a pop-up, there might be a dozen choices that you might give the user for how to do that thing. And depending on the context of your app, you may pick a different mix than someone else would pick. So you know, that's not even getting into new things, inventing new ways of doing things. This is just picking from things that other people have done before. There's a ton of variation. So so styling, like, that's part of it, but that's not all of it. I want to just zip through. We don't have a lot of time tonight. It's a complex topic. At the end of this, I'll leave a link that covers some of this in more detail. I want to talk about 6 techniques that we use. I'll start with sort of basic fundamental stuff that's purely standards based, and then look at some more advanced stuff that's a little more library specific and is sort of offered as inspiration. All this work is informed by an open source project that we lead called Elix. Elix is a library that's been under development for a number of years. Our goal is to create a comprehensive collection. We want to create super high quality implementations of every general purpose mobile or desktop UI pattern. So anything you can think of, drawer, menu, lightbox, pull to refresh, all of it. Like, if it's appearing in lots of apps, like, we want to have it in this library. It's the next 100 tags that should be in HTML. We want by the nature, I hope you can sort of guess, it's our goal to support extensive variation. So these techniques are informed, both the standards ones and the library specific ones are informed by this work. Please take a look at Elix. I'll have a link to that at the end. But the talk isn't about trying to get you to use that specific library. It's just saying, okay, we've been doing this for a while. Here are some ideas that you can think about. So let's dive in. Super basic starting point for building something customizable is you want to have that thing be as minimalist as possible. So for this, we need to distinguish, let's start with things like styling. We want to distinguish between style that's necessary for the component to just do its job versus everything else. So if I'm building a combo box and there's going to be a pop-up and there's also going to be an input element. The fact that the pop-up is left aligned with the input element in a left to right language, that styling is part of what makes this recognizable as a combo box. Like, if that pop-up were somewhere else, like, it wouldn't be that pattern, it would be something else. So that alignment and that juxtaposition, the fact that the pop-up touches the bottom of the input, that's part of what makes this pattern. So that styling belongs in the component. Everything else, we try and defer to the person who's going to use this component. That includes trying to inherit as much styling as possible from the document. So you can have, in a component like this, that calendar has a ton of HTML button elements in it. All those dates you can click on, there's a button inside of that. The default appearance of a button is going to have all this push button styling. It'll have rounded borders and a gray background, and it'll have the system UI font. Like, we don't want that. Or I should say, that's probably a poor default for buttons in a calendar. Like, maybe you want that, but like, most people wouldn't. So you can do things like font : inherit in your styling inside the shadow DOM on the host element, and it'll then participate in the cascade. So we can say, hey, these buttons, make them inherit the document font. If the person sets it to Helvetica, then the buttons inside this calendar will be in Helvetica. We can do that with things like there's a CSS property, current color, that you can use for the fill on your SVG icons. There's a bunch of things you can do like that to pick up the ambient styling on the page whenever you can. Like, that seems like a good way to get started. And then for everything else, we just want to defer that to the page author. We want the page author to figure out what they want the component to look like. Next technique is to talk about the content, the default content that goes inside of your component. So sometimes components have no visible UI of their own. They're sort of organizing the stuff that you put inside of it, that the page author is going to put inside of it. But sometimes components have visual adornments like these left and right arrows. Like those are being provided by the component. That's content. There's a SVG icon somewhere in there. Or you might have a button inside of your component that says submit on it. Like that word submit, like that's part of the default content. That's stuff that a component user, a page author, may want to change. And so you got to think about, okay, how am I going to do that? Well, there's a standards-based solution using slots. So in Shadow DOM, the Shadow DOM, Jordan mentioned this, for people who haven't written Shadow DOM code, just very briefly, you have a small private tree of elements that are hiding behind a custom tag. Here, elix.carousel has a bunch of elements hidden that the page normally doesn't interact with. And then inside of that shadow tree, we can put something called a slot. So inside of this carousel, somewhere in there, there's a div. And we can say, we want everything that goes in the light DOM, all those images, for example. We want all of them to be assigned to this spot as if they were sitting inside of that div. And that slot, it doesn't have any attributes, so that's called the default slot. That's where all those light DOM elements, those images, are going to end up. But there's other things going on this page. So we've got that little right arrow button. We can wrap that in a slot as well. So we can give it a name, arrow button next. We can put our SVG icon inside of it and stick that whole thing inside of the button. What this means is that in a case like this, where the page author has just defined some images and hasn't said anything about what they want to appear as the next arrow button, then it'll get that default SVG. That's what'll appear. But if they've got some other glyph that they want to use, they can include inside of the carousel other content, and they can tag it. They can say, this bit of content, don't show that, like, I don't want a giant glyph that the user is scrolling between. Instead, put that little glyph inside the arrow button. So this is a way, it doesn't cost the page author any conceptual overhead. Like if they don't want to target that thing, they never have to even know that it's there. There's no performance overhead. You're sort of only paying for it if you're using it. So this is a pretty great technique to deal with content that you want to be able to replace. Okay, let's talk about styling. So as Jordan said, styling can be tricky, and that is by design. So in the bad old days, like yesterday, if you were using a piece of UI from someone else, maybe it was packaged up as a widget that was going to inject a bunch of stuff into your DOM. And maybe that widget would inject a div somewhere. And you happen to have styling on the page that made divs red. Well, that's going to apply to the div that widget tried to inject. Maybe you didn't want that. In fact, a lot of times you might have sort of obscure CSS selectors. I want the last paragraph inside of this nav element to be, have a border above it, whatever, because that's what your page wanted. And then someone drops in a widget one day that happens to have something that meets that selector, and now that thing ends up with a border on it. So to make things predictable, we have these encapsulation boundaries around components. By default, the page, a page CSS, bit of CSS like this that's targeting divs will not affect a div that's inside of Shadow DOM. We like that most of the time. Where that breaks down is when someone wants to style something inside of a component. Like, hey, I don't want it to be the dots to be that size. I want them to be a bigger size. I want them to be pink. Like, how do I change that? So this was an unsolved problem until very recently, and is currently, there's work actively going on now to fix this, and some of it is shipping now. So there's a new CSS feature called CSS Shadow Parts, which is a way where a component author and a page author can cooperate on styling stuff that's inside of a component. The way this works is that the component author identifies the key elements inside their component that they think someone might want to style. So if there's a div, they say, okay, I'm going to call this the foo part. This is a part that I think someone's going to style, and they give it a name, and they put it in this attribute, this part attribute. From the outside, then, the page author can target that with a new CSS selector called : part. So this is, if you've ever done styling of like a scroll bar, there's these pseudo elements like the scroll bar thumb. So this is like custom pseudo elements for your components. The standards people often, like I really wanted it to be : foo, but they get really just a bunch, worried about forward breaking something in the future. If somebody decided to add : foo to the HTML spec, they'd be worried about breaking someone. So you have to have : part and then the name. That means that there's no programmatic way to inspect a component to find out what parts it has. You have to document that. It's also important to note that the page author does not get a reference to that part. They can't ask a component, give me a direct link or a reference to that div because I want to wire it up an event handler, or I want to remove it from the DOM, or other stuff like that. That's not what this is for. This is only meant for styling. So with a complex component, like in the Elix library or carousel, a complex component will have a bunch of parts. Most prominent one in the carousel is a part we call the stage. That's the big center place where the image or other content is going to go. And then there are a number of other parts. So we've got the buttons on the side, those arrow buttons. Parts can actually have multiple names, and the same name for a part can apply to multiple elements. Why do we do that? Well, let's say someone, the page author, wants to write styling that's going to target both of the arrow buttons. They want to make them both have a round border. Well, then they can use the arrow button name, and that'll target both of them. They could say : part, arrow dash button. If they only want to target the right one, or they can say : part, arrow button next, and they'll just target that specific part. So I hope gives a flavor of sort of how this gets used in practice. Let's look at an example. So we take like super basic minimalist carousel, very little going on here that's interesting. And then using CSS and no JavaScript code, we can get something that looks very different. So it's got CSS transitions and scaling transitions happening on the dots and whatever. So really anything that you want to be able to do with CSS, you can use CSS Shadow Parts to do. So that's pretty awesome. Like that'll address, I don't know, 80% of what people want to do with styling. Not everything, but a lot of it. Component Kitchen, we've been involved in the W3C working group that works on web components and sort of actively contributing feedback. Let's see. Some of that feedback actually came up. We discovered a bunch of things that we wanted page authors to be able to do that they couldn't do. One thing people want to do is have maybe apply different styling if the part is disabled or is in some other state. And maybe that state is custom to that component. Like you have a component that can open and close, a part that can open and close, and you want to target the open state differently. You want to style it differently than the closed state. So we pushed back and got added the ability to have custom pseudo classes like : hover or : focus. You can also have custom versions of that with a new CSS selector called : state. Part is shipping in Chrome today, in production Chrome. And in 2 months, when Chromium-based Edge releases to the world, it'll be in production Edge as well. Go Chromium. It's also in Firefox Nightly and in Safari STP. Best guess would be, I don't know, middle of next year by the time everybody has this in their hands. I mean, once we finally get out of the Edge HTML morass and can leave IE behind us, then everyone's going to be on the evergreen browser train. And so this stuff will very quickly get out into user hands. I don't know. I mean, I think this stuff is pretty exciting. It allows, think about this for a minute. You can take any component from any vendor, any web component, and style it using the same syntax. Like, I think that's mind-blowing. Today, a while back, I had to do a project looking at React and was just looking for some ideas on how to style React components. There's like a GitHub repo just tracking the styling solutions for React. I think there were like 50 libraries for styling React components the last time I checked. And they all depend on the page author and the component author cooperating, like agreeing on how something's going to be stylable. Like, so if you're building a component, you got to think about like, well, which of these 50 libraries am I going to expect people to use to target my component? And that really constrains the addressable audience for any one component. It also means that your skills don't translate very well. So like if you're a designer and you're living and breathing CSS, it's going to be awesome to be able to use that, everything you know about CSS as is, and apply it to web components. So that's all super exciting. It's not enough. So